realized this was a quid pro quo. I guess that's good to know. So the title of my talk, if I can get that slide to work. Here we go again with this. The title of my talk is The Story of Stories, which I realize, we're way ahead, is a little grandiose. But I'm not the one who called the last section godlike technology, so I feel okay. I'd feel okay about this. So there are so many stories in the world today. Right? More stories, I would say, than there have ever been before. I don't have statistics to back this up, but there are more people in the world today than there have ever been before, and more people means more stories. And I think there's no question that those stories are more widely accessible now than they have ever been, thanks to the internet and ebooks and self-publishing. But there is one story that rises above them all, one story that is central to Western culture, a story that is read and reread, passed from parent to child. Okay, so this is a joke. But I do want you to keep it in mind. I want you to keep it in mind because I'm going to come back to it. Now, the story of Western culture was and remains the Bible. Now, there's a difference between being the story and being a story. Right, so Snow White, for instance. Right, we think of Snow White and we picture the Disney version, which is the iconic version for almost all of us. But we know that the Disney version of Snow White isn't the story of Snow White. Because we know that the Disney version, like so many others, goes back to the version produced by the brothers Grimm, right, many, many years ago. And that version, we also know, is not the version of the Snow White story, because the Snow White story is a folk tale. Right? Its origins are lost in the mists of some archetypal storytelling. So when the version of the Brothers Grimm and the version from Disney aren't the same, we're not that bothered by it. And when the latest version is quite different still, no one is losing sleep. This isn't just true of folktales, right? There are some characters that are so compelling, they leap out of the pages of their story and into entirely new stories. So Arthur Conan Doyle gave us The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes. And since then, we have been blessed, really, with Sherlock upon Sherlock upon Sherlock upon Sherlock with no end in sight, and then without anyone complaining that any given Sherlock isn't the Sherlock. But there are some stories that become fixed, authoritative, and canonical, such that to render them in any different way becomes problematic, if not impossible. So, for instance, when the movie version of Harry Potter comes out, or Lord of the Rings, you end up with people yelling at the movie screen, that's not the way the story goes. They skipped that part of the story. Right? That's not in the story, and so on. Now, I understand people get crazy about Harry Potter and Lord of the Rings. Right? There is no accounting for the way that some people just get absolutely fixated on the accurate representation of a fictional landscape. Which brings me happily back to the Bible. Now, you may not have seen it, but surely you remember when it came out. Right? The Noah movie, right? Starring Russell Crowe as surely the chubbiest vegetarian in the ancient world. Now, some people in some quarters were upset by the film's explicit environmentalist messaging. But people on every side of the aisle got all up in arms about the characters that we fondly came to call the rock monsters. If there were ever an opportunity for you people to stand up at a movie screen and say, that's not the story, this would appear to be it. Now, the Bible is interesting this way. The Bible is interesting this way because we accept that it can have lots of different interpretations, right? There are lots of different meanings in it. We not only accept that, we authentically expect it, which is how you can have a new sermon given every week of every year in every church around the world. Right? We expect that the Bible generates lots of new meanings. But at the same time, we draw a really bright line between the story, right? The text, the immutable, unchangeable, fixed text story of the Bible, and then the million things that we can do with it. So when the Noah movie promotes a vegetarian agenda, we can say, I disagree with that interpretation of the story. And when it has rock monsters, we can say, that's not even the story anymore at all. part of it is that we've been culturally conditioned to think about the Bible as if it were Harry Potter, as if it were written by a single identifiable author, right? In this case, God, which people say also about the Bible. We think of it as coming from a single author, and therefore only the original version, right, is acceptable. The thing is, when it comes to the flood story at least, we know that the version of the flood story in the Bible isn't the original flood story. Right? Hundreds of years before the Bible was written, we had the Mesopotamian flood stories, which are patently translatable for all of you right here. You take my word for it. Mesopotamian flood stories. Flood stories, plural, right? Not one flood story, but many of them. Right? And these stories had some things in common with our flood story, of course. A divinely sent flood, a boat, a sole survivor, but there were important differences as well. In a lot of the Mesopotamian stories, the rationale for the eradication of humanity was that people were too loud for the gods. We were too noisy for the gods. The gods, of course, plural, this being Mesopotamian telling, right? Where the gods are using humans as sort of proxies for their heavenly squabbles. Try telling someone today that that is the original and real flood story. The thing is, the Bible, the flood story, especially the Old Testament, is not written by a single author who we can identify. Right? We talk about it like it's Harry Potter, but it's Snow White. Right? It's folklore. It's folktale told by different people in different places at different times. And yet, the version that we find in the Bible has somehow become, right, the authoritative version, right? The one that we all talk about. And I think that this is ironic. And now, you don't have time to go run to your home and open your Bibles right now. But when you get home, and you go to run to your Bibles, as I know you will, open Genesis 6 through 9 and try and read the flood story there. Try and read the flood story there. I think you'll find it more difficult than you would imagine. I'm not going to go into all the details now, but I'm going to give you a quick rundown. How many times does God tell Noah he's going to bring the flood? Twice. And how many animals is Noah supposed to bring on board? This one should be easy, right? 2, right? One of each, male and female, except also 7 pairs. So there's an extra 14 of each animal that no one was accounting for. And the thing is, it says to do these 2 things, and then it tells us that Noah did them both, which means that ark was a lot more crowded than anyone ever thought it was. Where does the water from the flood come from? Does it fall from the sky like rain? Does it shoot up from the ground like a fountain? Both? How long does the flood last? Everyone knows this one, 40 days and 40 nights, except for the part where it says clearly 150 days. How many birds does Noah send out? Who remembers the raven, right, from this story? How many times does God tell Noah he's never going to bring another flood? Twice. And here's one that's not in the movie, and almost nobody talks about. After God has told Noah to take animals on board to save life, to preserve life for after the flood. And when at the end of the flood, God has said to the creatures, to the animals, go forth and multiply and fill the earth. After all that, immediately after that, why does Noah think that it's probably a really good idea to take those saved and blessed animals and kill them? Long story short, the biblical flood story is actually 2 flood stories. And this is something that scholars have known for literally hundreds of years, and may sound familiar to the people who saw me here last year when I said something similar about creation. 2 flood stories, and neither one of them is the flood story, right? If you tried to make a movie out of either one of these, you'd have people standing up and yelling at the screen, that's not the story. But the version in the Bible isn't the story either, because it's got all of this. No one's telling a flood story with 7 pairs of animals and 150 days of rain. No one's telling that story. That's not the flood story. We have to accept that the flood story, as we think about it, is an interpretation that picks and chooses, bits and parts, giveaway, picks and chooses, right, from different aspects, so that we get the story with a pair of animals and rain and 40 days a dove, and the one that ends with the rainbow instead of with all the sacrificing, right? And so I think, right, we have to accept the flood story that we know, the culturally accepted flood story, is not from the Bible. It's just not. Our culturally accepted flood story is from a children's song. It's from a children's song, and you know this song. Right? You know the song. Right? The animals, they came on by twosies, twosies. It rained and poured for 40 daisies, daisies. That's the culturally accepted flood story. It's from a children's song. So what's happened is we have created a master narrative of the flood story and attributed it falsely to the ultimate literary authority in Western culture, to the Bible. I want to be clear, this isn't something we do only with the flood story. We do this also with other famous parts of the Bible. So the culturally accepted life of Jesus is like a greatest hits album compiled from the best parts of the four Gospels. Right. What's interesting is that the flood story and the Gospels both provide evidence that there was a time when it was possible to hold multiple versions of these stories at the same time, for them to peacefully coexist. So how do we go from multiple Mesopotamian flood stories to multiple Israelite biblical flood stories to, in 2014, people yelling at movie screens, that's not the flood story? How did we get there? Well, the answer is, at some point in the early first millennium AD, this is well after the Bible was written, it already existed for a while, after a few hundred years after it was written, it became authoritative, the version as we know and love it. It became authoritative, and this wasn't an authority that it sort of just grew into. This is authority that was bestowed upon it by us, right? By people, by a culture that chose this to be the story as opposed to all the other stories that were out there. We did this, and the authority we gave the Bible was exclusive, right? This story and not those. And those stories were largely lost to us forever, most of them. Some of them we've only recovered in the last 100 years or so. So here you can think about the Dead Sea Scrolls or the Gnostic Gospels, right? These are some of those lost stories, the ones that didn't make the cut, that weren't chosen to be the story. Among these lost stories, by the way, the rock monsters that have a good 2,000-year-old pedigree as part of the story of Genesis. They just didn't make it into the story. For 2,000 years, the production of alternative narratives, of counter-narratives to the Bible, has been really carefully controlled, as frankly has all literary production. What's interesting is where we are right now. Right now, at a moment when the production of counter-narratives, of alternatives, has never been easier. Right? To a certain extent, we are living now in an era that is a return to that world of oral folklore, right? Except that instead of gathering around the village square to hear our stories, we just go to our favorite website. The production of counter-narratives is no longer frowned upon as it was for so long. It's now the absolute norm, right? Fully half the internet, as far as I can tell, is fan fiction. Right? Production of counter-narratives is absolutely the norm. So what's interesting to me then is the question of what we do in this space. What do we do in this space where everybody is producing multiple narratives, and even though we see so many narratives around us, more stories than have ever been told before, we still seem to long for that one story that we can hold on to, that we can call the story. Right? Even though it's historically indefensible, even though it's at odds with everything we see around us, we still long for that one story, the story. Because storytelling is how we make sense of ourselves. It was then and it is now. It's how we understand our place in the world and our relationship with others. Too many stories can be existentially confusing. So we choose one. We choose one to be the story. Even though we know that it may not be any more valid than the one we didn't choose. And that's fine. The problem is when we forget as a culture that we chose the story. Because when we forget that we chose, we end up imposing our story on other people. My story will become authoritative for you. Your story, your alternative story, becomes like vilified and even at times criminalized. We end up yelling at movie screens, that's not the story. So the lesson here to leave with. When we read the stories we read, and when we choose the stories that we still choose, and when, as we are here, I think, when we create the new stories we create, right, to remember what is the story to us is only a story to them. And every story is the story to someone. Thank you.